the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 19, looking at the groups and teams of the 2023 Asian Cup, played in January 2024. This episode is looking at Group A, host Qatar, China, Tajikistan, and Lebanon. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada, Series 19. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Connor. And today we are looking at Group A for the Asian Cup 2023 tournament, taking place in January 2024. This group includes Qatar, China, Lebanon, and Tajikistan.
Yeah, and we usually give some information about the media cast at this point, but we're going to save it until the end here. So stay tuned at the end for info about our recently past and current series, and also our plans for the upcoming series. Meanwhile, let's get on with it.
So this series features a deep dive into the history of the regional tournament for each of the teams. That's the Asian Cup. And we're going to cover our usual information.
Yeah, so let's look at the three sections that we'll cover in this podcast. Part one, we're going to introduce the countries in the group and give a little information about the countries.
For part two, we'll do an in-depth team-by-team overview. And this series features the deep dive into each team's history in the Asian Cup tournament.
Yeah, and in that section, we're also including a bit of information about their local cups, which play a larger role in Asia. So we think it's important to include.
Yeah. And then part three is a comparison of the teams in their rankings and head-to-head records. And we'll end with a discussion of their prospects and our predictions.
Right. Okay, well, let's jump right on in. And we begin with the country information on Qatar.
So starting with Qatar, their nickname is the Crimsons. Qatar is a country of 2.7 million people. It's actually the second smallest country competing in this tournament, only ahead of near neighbors Bahrain. And Qatar is located on a small peninsula in the Persian Gulf, bordering Saudi Arabia to the south, and like I said, near to the island nation of Bahrain as well.
All right, and Connor, for this series, I actually ordered a Qatar jersey because they're the hosts of the tournament, but it didn't arrive, so I have to do just the colors. What do you think of my attempt at the colors of Qatar?
It's a good match. I give you credit for that.
Well, maybe for Group B, I'll actually have the shirt. Okay, well, the second team is China.
Yeah, their nickname is Team Dragon, or the Dragons. China, of course, is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of population, 1.4 billion. It's actually the second largest in Asia. It was recently surpassed by India.
Wow.
And China is the largest country in Asia after Russia. And it actually shares a border with 14 other countries, which is the most in the world.
Wow, interesting. All right, team number three is Lebanon.
Yeah, Lebanon, they're known as the Cedars, reference to the national symbol, which is also on their flag. Lebanon has 5.3 million people, and it's a small country on the East Mediterranean, bordered by Syria to the north and east, and Israel to the south. And then its western border is on the Mediterranean Sea, as I said. All
right, and finally, Tajikistan.
Yeah, Tajikistan, they're just known as the national team, but in Tajik. Their population is just over 10 million people, and it's a mountainous landlocked country in Central Asia, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan in the north, China to the east, Afghanistan to the south, and Uzbekistan to the west.
All right, cool. All right, well, we have a bunch of information there, so let's look at them in comparison to each other.
Yeah, so by far the largest country in terms of population is China with its 1.4 billion people. Next actually is Tajikistan, 10.1 million people. So obviously much smaller, but the second largest country in the group. Lebanon has 5.3 million people. That ranks them third. And then the smallest country is the host Qatar, just 2.7 million people.
All right. Well, nice and mathematical there. Tajikistan, twice as large as Lebanon, which is twice as large as Qatar.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that is the end of part one, and now we move on to part two, where we look at each country, and we begin with Qatar, and just an overview of their overall participation and strength.
So Qatar played its first international game in 1970, even though its involvement with football goes back to the 1940s. They began competing in the Asian Cup in 1976 and the World Cup in 1978. And their participation has been consistent throughout.
Yeah, they also take part in more regional competitions. So all Asian and African countries are members of a regional group. Qatar's is the West Asian Football Federation, or WAF, and they held competitions roughly every 2 years from 2000 to 2014, but actually went dormant after that until taking up again in 2019. For a competition that's supposedly going to be held every 4 years, although they didn't do anything in 2023. Qatar has not participated much, though, in that one, entering only 2 of the 8 editions to 2014. They didn't enter in 2019. And that competition itself is, as we said, inconsistent. And perhaps it is so because the Gulf Cup of Nations is a more established competition in that region. So from 1970, that takes place roughly every 2 years, and in some periods every year. Qatar's participation, sorry, I'm just moving to the proper graphic here. Qatar's participation has been good. They participated in each of the 25 editions of the Gulf Cup up until 2023 here. And that competition is not backed by FIFA, but now there's a new competition in competition with the competitions. So the FIFA Arab Cup is old, having been first played in 1963, and it's kind of come and gone. It's kind of on again and off again. But in 2021, it was revived again and renamed the FIFA Arab Cup. So Qatar actually hosted the 10th edition of that tournament in 2021. Yes, and then finally, Qatar is a very busy country, so not all of the countries will be quite like this, but in preparation for the 2022 World Cup, they joined the regional competitions in other parts of the world, the 2019 Copa America in South America, and both the 2021 and 2023 editions of the Gold Cup in North and Central America. Woo! I can't believe I got through that, Connor.
Wow. All right, well, in terms of Qatar's overall strength, they are a strong second-tier team in Asia. They had never reached a World Cup until hosting it in 2022, and they normally struggled to reach the final round of qualification. Their preparation for that World Cup was a bid to become a top-tier team, and they reached it by winning the 2019 Asian Cup. However, they peaked a bit too soon and did not maintain that level. Normally, they did well to pass the group stage of the Asian Cup.
All right. Well, let's take a look at their World Cup overview, and maybe you can take us through that one.
Yeah, so in terms of achievement, Qatar had never reached a World Cup until hosting in 2022. From their first campaign in 1978, where despite hosting the qualification group, they managed only a win over Bahrain and lost all other matches to finish last in the group, they progressed steadily upwards, coming behind Bahrain in 1978, but ahead of them in 1982, and coming behind Iraq in 1982 and 86, but ahead of them in 1990. 1990 was an excellent year where they tied South Korea and Saudi Arabia, beat China, and actually came within a point of World Cup qualification. That was a peak, though, and they haven't come close to that since. However, they usually reach the final round of qualification, failing to do so only in 1994 and 2006. Once there, though, they are out of their league, finishing 4th of 5 every time. Even in 2018, as their preparations for hosting ramped up, they finished last of 6. As disappointing as it was to lose all games in the cup they hosted in 2022, it was ultimately kind of a par result for a second-tier Asian team.
All right. Well, let's move on to our Asian Cup overview. And, well, despite, maybe you can do that one too, Connor.
Sure. So despite usually qualifying for the Asian Cup, 1976 and 1996 were Qatar's only failures. Their best result had been reaching the quarterfinals in 2002 and again as hosts in 2011. It was thus a surprise when they swept through the tournament in 2019 and convincingly won. They are the defending champions. It was not such a surprise to those who knew of their preparations through their Aspire Academy and cooperation with Barcelona as they built their team towards hosting the World Cup in 2022. But nevertheless, it was amazing to see them go on to such an incredible run, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail.
All right. Well, let's move on and talk a little bit about their local cup. So we'll begin with the WAF Cup there. And actually, they've only entered two of the versions of the WAF Cup. Actually, they and a bunch of other Gulf countries entered in 2008. So that group was established in 2000, but there were only 6 members until the Gulf nations joined. Qatar reached the semifinals in the 2008 version, and they won it as hosts in 2013, but otherwise they didn't enter any of the tournaments. Okay, and then moving on to the Arab Cup. The Arab Cup, as we said, is an old tournament that was revamped in 2021 and taken over by FIFA. As far as Qatar goes, though, they really only entered 2 of the 11 editions that started way back in 1963, a really on-again and off-again cup. In 1985, they finished 4th, and in 1998, they finished 2nd. And then in the recent 2021 edition, they finished in 3rd place. Those are their only 3 participations. And finally, we'll take a look at the Gulf Cup. That seems to be really the regional cup there. And they've entered every edition, all 25 editions since its start in 1970. And they have won twice. They've won, 3 times, twice as host in 1992 and 2004, and then again in 2014. And in the most recent editions, 2019 and 2023, they reached the semifinals of the Gulf Nations Cup. All right, well, we're going to move on to our deep dive into the Asian Cup finals. So do you want to start us off there?
Sure. So the Asian Cup began in 1956, but 1976 was Qatar's first entry. They did not qualify that year, but otherwise failed to qualify only one other time. That was in 1996.
Right, 1980. So their first successful qualification, they finished 4th in the 5-team group stage, losing to South Korea and Kuwait, and tying Malaysia, who they finished behind. They did beat UAE to finish ahead of them that year. 1984 was slightly better. They tied group winner Saudi Arabia and beat a shockingly poor South Korea to finish 3rd of 5 in the group stage. And 1988 was the same result, 3rd of 5, just 1 point short of reaching the final round there.
1992 saw a 4-team group stage and an inconsistent performance, tying group winners Saudi Arabia, but also bottom finisher Thailand. They then lost to China in the final game and finished in 3rd behind them. So they didn't move beyond the group stage, and it actually proved a weak period as Qatar failed to reach the Cup in 1996.
Right, but in 2000, they reached beyond the group stage for the first time in a competitive, although not totally impressive showing. They tied all group stage games with Uzbekistan, Saudi Arabia, and Japan, and they advanced as a 3rd place finisher in the group. So they did get to the quarterfinals, but they lost to China there. and they finished bottom of the group in 2004 and in 2007, earning ties at best, although a tie with Japan in the first game in 2007 was an achievement.
2011 began with a loss to Uzbekistan, but wins over China and Kuwait saw them advance from the group stage for the second time in their history. The quarterfinal looked promising, up 2-1 on Japan, who were down to 10 men. However, Qatar suffered goals at 70 and 90, eschewing a bid for challenging at the top tier.
2015 was a good period in the smaller regional cups. They won the 2014 WAF Cup and the 2014 Gulf Cup of Nations. However, it was their worst performance at an Asian Cup. There they lost all 3 games to UAE, Iran, and Bahrain and finished dead last in the group.
Yeah, so that performance in particular, and generally proving a second-tier team in the region, made the surprise of 2019 even more impactful. But we'll look at that as we go into their more recent tournaments in a bit more detail.
Right, so we're going to start the recent history from 2019, and the first tournament was supposed to be the local cup, the West Asian Football Federation Cup in 2019. However, Qatar didn't enter that one. I think instead they entered the South American, Copa America.
That's right, yeah.
So you were just about to tell us about the Asian Cup in 2019, and that's where we're at.
Yeah. So just beginning with qualification, 2018 World Cup qualifying made up the first 2 rounds of qualification. So their first place finish in round 2 ahead of China and Hong Kong qualified them automatically for the tournament. Though they came in showing youthful promise, no one expected Qatar to have such spectacular success. They stormed through the tournament, starting with 2 of the weakest teams in Lebanon and North Korea, but then beating Saudi Arabia to take first place in the group stage. From there on, they beat Iraq, South Korea, host UAE, and then Japan in the final. And actually, they gave up their only goal of the tournament in that final against Japan in a game they ultimately won 3-1.
Yeah, really steamrolled the other teams there. It was quite impressive to watch. I wonder how Lebanon feels about meeting them in this group again.
Yeah, it was 19 goals for and 1 against en route to victory. Just amazing.
Wow. That was an amazing performance. Okay, well, the next one was the Arab Cup. We talked about that as being kind of a warm-up for hosting the World Cup, and that was in 2021 in Qatar. So how about that one?
Yeah, so Qatar hosted that tournament as a preparation really for the World Cup the following year. In the group stage, they won all 3 of their games, beating Bahrain, Oman on a very late goal, an own goal in fact, and then Iraq. They crushed UAE 5-0 in the quarterfinals, and then faced Algeria in the semifinals. In an exciting game in front of a massive crowd of 42,000, many of them Algerians, it must be said, Qatar managed an equalizer at 90 plus 7. It seemed set to go into extra time until Algeria got a penalty. That penalty was saved, but the rebound was put in, get this, 17 minutes into injury time. So Qatar was relegated to the 3rd place match where they beat Egypt on penalties. So they didn't get to the finals or win it, but following up from the 2019 Asian Cup, it was a pretty strong showing.
Yeah, I mean, Algeria wasn't one of the teams that reached the World Cup, but they're probably, one of the top teams in the African Federation there. So, as you say, a good performance. Now, let's take a look at their journey in the 2022 World Cup.
Yeah, so Qatar qualified automatically as hosts. They actually did participate in some of the earlier rounds of qualification simply because that served as qualification for this Asian Cup. But despite years of preparation by Qatar, they lost all 3 games at the World Cup finals to Ecuador, Senegal, and Netherlands, and finished last in the group stage. Nevertheless, though, they successfully hosted what I think was one of the best World Cups.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, I kind of hope they did a little better. I would have loved to see the form of the 2019 Asian Cup brought into the World Cup there. I think they would have been a bit tough to handle, really.
Yeah, I was disappointed they didn't kind of show the very best of themselves. But obviously the competition, and in the World Cup is kind of the maximum that they're up against.
Yeah. Well, the last tournament is fairly recent in 2023. It's the Gulf Cup.
Yeah, so Iraq beat Kuwait in their opener, but then lost to Bahrain. A tie with UAE was enough to see them second in the group stage, which put them into a semifinals. There they met Iraq, who were hosting the tournament, and Qatar lost that match 2-1.
In the semi-final. So yes, again, not showing the strength that they showed in 2009. Oh, so 2019. But wait, I was wrong. Qatar plays all sorts of tournaments, and they did join the 2021 Gold Cup, which we won't cover here, but they did join the 2023 Gold Cup there in June and July of 2023. How did they do there?
Yeah, so new manager Carlos Queiroz brought in change with several stars replaced and a more defensive style and frankly a more negative sentiment. The defensive style didn't work as they gave up a late winner to Haiti and a late tying goal to Honduras. They were overwhelmed by Mexico in the third game, but somehow won on a single goal to advance to the quarterfinals. Suffering several yellow card suspensions, 13 yellows and a red in the group stage, they ended up losing heavily to Panama in the quarterfinals, that game finishing 4-0.
Yeah, okay, that is finally. I mean, I can guarantee you, not all teams are going to be as extensive as Qatar, who seem to play every game they can get their hands on. We'll finish then with how they got here, and we've actually already covered it, but maybe you can just brief over it.
Yeah, so rounds 1 and 2 of World Cup 2022 qualifying were also the first 2 rounds of Asian Cup qualifying. So Qatar received the bye in round 1, which only the 12 weakest teams had to undergo, then finished first in the round 2 or 3 qualifying group. So that result qualified them automatically for the Asian Cup. Most teams played a further round of World Cup qualifying, while other teams played further qualifying rounds for the Asian Cup. But Qatar, as you mentioned, found other ways to fill their schedule.
Yeah, that's right. Wow, we spent a long time on Qatar. It's kind of hard not to, given how much they play. But I think it's time to move on, Connor, to China.
All right, China.
Okay, well, let's begin with kind of an overview of their participation and general strength. So China first entered the World Cup in 1958 and experienced some of the tough luck that would kind of become a theme for them. Whether because of that or for other reasons, they didn't enter again until 1982. But from that time, they participated consistently. The Asian Cup began in 1956, but like Qatar, they didn't enter until 1967. Oh, sorry, 1976, although they have participated consistently from that time. And finally, their regional group is a bit simpler than the Middle East there. They just have the one East Asian Football Confederation, and that consists of 10 countries. We'll talk a bit more about that later. China has taken part in each one of the 8 editions of that cup from its start in 2003.
Yeah. So for a country of China's size, their status in the region and really their success in other sports, they've really done poorly in soccer. In terms of their overall strength, China is an inconsistent second-tier team in Asia. They struggle to reach the final round of World Cup qualification and are out of depth if they do make it. On the stronger side of second tier, they have always reached the Asian Cup and often passed the group stage. Having done better in the past, the quarterfinals now seems to be their ceiling.
Yeah, and we'll get into that with a little more detail with a World Cup overview. So they reached the World Cup only once. That was in 2002. And actually, they were aided in getting there by dint of the Cup being in Asia. So South Korea and Japan qualified automatically and were not competing for spots. China nevertheless had a good qualification there, and finished far ahead of UAE and Uzbekistan to qualify. It was arguably not worth it, though, as they lost to Costa Rica, Brazil, and Turkey and exited the tournament without scoring a goal. They had come very close to qualifying in 1982, where they lost a final playoff to New Zealand, and to a lesser degree in 1998, where they were just 1 point shy of an advancing spot, although they would have had to win 2 rounds of playoffs to actually reach the cup there. The next 3 editions after reaching the cup in 2002 saw them fail to qualify for the final round of qualification. 2014 was a typical performance, finishing 3rd behind Iraq and Jordan in the semi-final round. And in 2018 and 2022, they did reach the final round, but finished 5th of 6 in both cases. Okay, and we'll talk about their 2022 qualifications in the recent section, but we'll move on to their Asian Cup overview.
So China have fared better in the Asian Cup, where they have reached which they have reached every time since their first entry in 1976. They did well in the early years, finishing in the top 4 out of the first 5 times, and finishing 2nd in 1984, making that a good period for them. After a quarterfinal finish in 1996, they finished 4th in 2000 and then 2nd when they hosted in 2004. Since then, though, they were knocked out at the group stage twice, then reached only the quarterfinals twice in 2015 and 2019, which were their most recent tournaments.
Right. And before doing a deep dive into their Asian Cup history, we'll take a look at their local cup. That's the East Asian Football Federation. Do you want to do that one?
Sure. So Eastern Asia takes their local tournament more seriously than most, usually with teams sending their best squads. China has enjoyed more success in the East Asian Cup, which is usually themselves, South Korea, Japan, and one other team, usually North Korea or Hong Kong, in a round-robin tournament which started in 2003. They won the 2nd edition in 2005 and the 4th edition in 2010, but have placed 3rd in the last 3 editions since 2015.
Yeah, so that East Asian Football Federation is actually 10 teams, and other than the ones we've mentioned, the teams are quite weak. I think it's kind of funny, actually, because I think Japan, South Korea, and China get automatic qualification into it, and then all of the other teams fight for the remaining spot. Okay, let's jump into our deep dive then for the Asian Cup, and take it away.
So China's first Asian Cup was in 1976, and they never missed a cup, although qualifying was always necessary except for 2004 when they hosted. Qualification campaigns are ignored in this look at their history, where our focus is on the finals.
Yeah, in 1976, they were lucky to get past the group stage, actually. A tie with Malaysia was enough to see them past the 3-team group stage, where they took 2nd on goal difference. But they lost to Iran in extra time in the semi-final, and then beat Iraq to finish in 3rd place.
1980 saw a 5-team group stage, but they finished 4th behind North Korea and Syria. It would be their only group stage exit until 2007. 1984 saw them top the 5-team group, losing in the opener to Iran, but they beat hosts Singapore, India, and UAE. They beat Kuwait in the semifinal, but lost to Saudi Arabia in the final for a 2nd place finish.
Yeah, 1988 was a 3rd place, a 4th place. Wait a minute, I'm all wrong here. No, 2nd place in the 5-team group stage behind Saudi Arabia. They were actually competitive in the final stages, losing only in extra time to South Korea in the semi-final, and then on penalties to Iran in the 3rd place match for a 4th place finish. And their top 4 finishes continued in 1992. And there they came 2nd in the group stage behind Saudi Arabia, and lost in the semi-final to Japan, but beat UAE on penalties to finish 3rd in that tournament.
The streak of top four finishes took a pause in 1996. They were lucky to get past the group stage with just a single win over Syria. Behind group winner Japan, 3 teams ended with 3 points, but China took second based on the best goal difference. In the quarterfinal, they took a 2-0 lead over Saudi Arabia by 16 minutes, but were down 2-3 at halftime and eventually lost that match 4-3.
Okay, well, 2000 saw them back in the top 4. Going undefeated in the group stage, they tied South Korea and finished first for the first time since 1984. And then after beating Kuwait in the quarterfinals, they fell to Japan in the semifinals and then met South Korea again in the third place match and lost that. So another 4th place finish there in 2000.
I'll just correct you to say they beat Qatar in the quarterfinals, not Kuwait.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
In 2004, China hosted, and after an opening draw with Bahrain, they beat Indonesia and Qatar to finish first in the group stage. They went on to beat Iraq and then Iran on penalties to reach the final. Their 3-1 loss to Japan in the final was a bitter pill, and there was fury over the refereeing, particularly a handball on Japan's second goal, leading to rioting in the streets, with Japanese fans unable to leave the stadium for 3 hours. And China actually refused their second place medals.
Oh, that was one of the first Asian Cups I was able to watch. It was a good one. Yeah, all right. Well, moving on to 2007. Actually, that second place finish in 2004 proved the peak of their success, and the quarterfinals would be the furthest reach in tournaments after that. A 3-0 loss to Uzbekistan condemned them to a third place finish in the 2007 version, and it was the same result in 2011 where they tied Uzbekistan, but only after a second game loss to Qatar. So 2 third place finishes in the group stage in a row.
2015 saw them win all group stage games over Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and North Korea. However, they were unlucky to meet host Australia, who had finished second in their group behind South Korea. They lost that game 2-0 for a quarterfinal exit.
All right, and that brings us to the recent history, and it's the first tournament we'll cover for them, the 2019 Asian Cup, which we'll cover in more detail. Take it away.
Yeah, so China didn't have to enter at the preliminary round, but entered at the round 2 of 3 group stage. And there they were grouped with Qatar. China actually beat them at home, though lost to them away. But overall, they finished second in the group. So that was good enough to qualify automatically for the 2019 Asian Cup.
All right. And so in the group stage?
Yeah, they started very well with wins over Kyrgyzstan and Philippines before losing to South Korea, but they still went through in second place. In the round of 16, they overcame Thailand 2-1 before being beaten 3-0 by Iran. So it was a quarterfinal exit for China.
All right. Okay, well, the next tournament we'll look at is their local cup in 2022. And I got to say here, Connor, a bit of a strange thing in Asia. We've seen that Asia is probably the best region for being inclusive to smaller teams. But I'm not sure the East Asian region is down, or locality is down with that, because they've always just appointed South Korea, Japan, and China to the 4-team tournament, and then North Korea and Hong Kong basically play off for the others. The rest are all weak teams, so the qualifying tournament is kind of the tournament for them. But in 2022, they just cancelled the qualifying tournament and chose the top 4 ranked teams according to FIFA. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very unequal region, the EAFF, with, you know, World Cup perennials versus kind of micronations. But you're right, the smaller teams then lose on a chance to compete with teams at a similar level. So I guess in that perspective, you do miss out on something.
Yeah, I kind of cynically say that it seems more like CONCACAF than it does Asia.
Yeah.
Anyway, China was kind of appointed to that cup, and let's see how they did in 2022.
Yeah, so it started with a 3-0 loss to South Korea. They then got a good draw with Japan before beating Hong Kong. So it was a win, a draw, and a loss, but that had them third of the 4-team group. Japan, South Korea, China, Hong Kong was the order.
Yeah, and that's a fairly typical order, at least as far as China goes, finishing third there. Next tournament is the World Cup in 2022.
Yeah, they again entered at the round 2 of 3 group stage and performed fairly well, winning 6 of their 8 games, drawing 1 and losing only to group winners Syria. But they finished second in the group, 8 points ahead of third place Philippines. So that put them into the final round. They were grouped in a group of 6, but they found the stiffer competition more difficult. They won only 1 game. That was a home win against Vietnam, tying 3 others at home, but then losing 1 at home and all 5 on the road. So they finished with just 6 points, which was 9 points off of a qualifying place.
Yeah, wow, 5th out of 6 there, just ahead of Vietnam, but a pretty weak performance. Okay, well, those first 2 rounds that Connor just talked about actually made up the first 2 rounds of Asian Cup qualifying. And so how does that look in terms of the Asian Cup?
Yeah, because they qualified for the final round of World Cup qualification, finishing second in their group behind Syria, that automatically qualified them for the Asian Cup. So they got here at the first hurdle.
Yeah, okay, well, that makes short news of it. Not many actual games for China, I would say, over the last couple of years, especially this year. So World Cup 2026 qualifying begins soon, so they'll get a couple of games in there. Okay, well, we have decided to skip the player section because it's a bit off topic from this media cast, and it also makes it a bit too long. So we're going to do separate podcasts on the players. And also we might do an update closer to the actual competition there. So that might come out in December if there's enough new stuff that's happened for us to update. But meanwhile, we'll keep focused on the teams here, and it's time to move on to Lebanon. And we'll take a look first at their overall participation and strength.
So Lebanon first entered the World Cup in 1986, but were hammered in each of the 4 games they played and withdrew. They returned in 1994 and have participated consistently since. They had entered the Asian Cup much earlier, in 1972, but their participation was scattered. They were absent for 3 of the 4 editions afterwards, and participation became consistent only from 1996 onward, except for 2007 when they withdrew after 1 game. They are also part of the West Asian Football Federation, or WAF, a local group made up of 12 Middle Eastern teams. Lebanon entered from the first edition in 2000, with a break in participation for 2 editions between 2008 and 10.
Right, and in terms of their overall strength, Lebanon is a weak second-tier team in Asia. They struggle to reach the final round of World Cup qualification and are well out of their depth if they do make it. And similarly, they struggle to reach the Asian Cup, but probably will have more regular appearances now that the Cup has expanded to 24 teams. They've never passed the group stage of an Asian Cup. All right, so let's focus in a little more and do an overview of their World Cup history.
So Lebanon is never far from the final round in World Cup qualification, but they achieved it only twice, in 2014 and 2022. In both cases, they proved out of their depth once there, finishing last in the table. They've usually been competitive in their semi-final group, finishing 1 or 2 spots below the advancing team. 2010 was a step back when they finished last in their group, losing all games, which made their 2014 success, passing the semifinal stage, which included a home win over South Korea, and made it a bigger surprise. They failed to repeat in 2018, though, a home draw with Myanmar contributing to them being the only second place finisher not to advance. They returned to the final round robin in 2022, but again, it was a last place finish.
Right. Okay, that is as much as we'll do for the World Cup here. But we're going to do an overview of the Regional Cup before the deep dive. And in their 3 Asian Cup entries from 1972 to 1996, they fell just short of reaching the Cup. They finally reached it in 2000. That was by dint of hosting it. And there they managed only 2 draws and finished last in the group stage. After that, they were far from passing the qualifying group until 2015, where they finished just a point behind Kuwait. Having come close and improving their form, they looked a likely candidate to reach the expanded 2019 edition, which they did. And we will take a look at their recent history when we get to that point. But first, before the deep dive, let's take a look at their local cup, which, like Kuwait, is the WAF Cup.
Yeah, so in the West Asian Football Federation, they have never passed the group stage. This meant when the federation was made up of just 6 nations, they finished bottom of a group of 3, the other members being Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Palestine. It became that much tougher with the infusion of the 7 Gulf nations, and in 2019, they finished 4th in a group of 5 behind Palestine and Yemen, but at least ahead of Syria. They are, however, a team that should be passing the group stage sometimes, so it's overall a disappointing record here.
Yeah, that's right. Now they're not a Gulf Nations team, but they are eligible for the Arab Cup. So once again, that tournament has kind of been an on again, off again affair. But they've actually taken advantage of it in the early years. In the first 3 tournaments, they finished in the top 4. Twice. Their best finish was 3rd place in the first edition in 1963, and the next 2 editions were 64 and 66. However, after that, there were 2 tournaments they didn't enter, and 5 tournaments where they did enter and were knocked out at the group stage in all of those, 2021 being the most recent one, and we'll take a look at that in the recent section. Okay, so now we do the deep dive into the Asian Cup finals, and that begins in 1972. Do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, well, they didn't qualify in 72, and for a couple editions after that. Lebanon's qualification history in the Cup is interesting and actually gives a better sense of their strength. But because this examination focuses only on the final themselves, and as in the final round of World Cup qualifying, they are beyond their depth at this level.
Yeah, in fact, do you want to continue?
Sure. So actually, I said it'd been a couple editions. The first tournament they qualified for was in 2000, and there they earned passage as hosts, as we mentioned earlier. Even that advantage did not help much. In their opener, they held Iran to a single goal until 75 minutes, but then allowed 3 goals for a heavy 4-0 loss. They tied Iraq and Thailand, but it was not enough to avoid a last place finish at the group stage, so disappointing as hosts.
Yeah, and maybe the deep dive is disappointing because the only other time they reached the Asian Cup was in 2019, and we cover that. We cover that in the recent section. So really not much history in the finals of the Asian Cup for Lebanon, but they'll be hoping to build that history, over the next little while. Okay, let us go to our deep dive then. And actually, we're going to begin that deep dive with their performance in the 2019 WAF champion, West African Football Federation championship.
Yeah, so this is something where a tournament Lebanon should be competitive on, but in 2019, they weren't really. They lost to both Iraq and Yemen, tied Palestine, but then did beat Syria. Syria were the only team they finished ahead of, though, in the 5-team group.
Yeah, a pretty weak performance by both them and Syria in that cup. Now we do move on to the 2019 Asian Cup. The first 2 rounds of that were the 2018 World Cup.
Yeah, so Lebanon finished second out of 5. However, it was 13 points behind group winner South Korea. So as you mentioned, they were the only second place team to miss out on the final round. And that's because they finished second place, but with a mere 11 points. It was just ahead of Kuwait with 10 and Myanmar with 8. So it was a record of 3 wins, 2 draws, and 3 losses. They didn't go to the final round of the World Cup, and they didn't qualify automatically for the Cup, but needed a second group stage. There, though, they were paired with North Korea, Hong Kong, and Malaysia, and won 5 out of their 6 games. The only blemish, a draw in North Korea. So they qualified in the final round of qualifying.
Right, so they did reach the Cup, so their Asian Cup finals history gets doubled here. And how did they do in the Cup?
Yeah, they lost their first 2 games to tough opposition, to Qatar and Saudi Arabia. It left them with little to play for in their final match, though they did beat North Korea 4-1 to finish 3rd out of 4.
Yeah, 3rd out of 4. So once again, not passing the group stage. So that'll be kind of their goal going forward. The next competition was the one we alluded to, the Arab Cup in 2021. And this was a bigger version of the Arab Cup now that it's become a FIFA competition. How did they do?
So they needed a playoff to get there, which they won by beating Djibouti. And then it was actually almost identical to their Asian Cup. They started off with 2 losses to strong opposition. It was Egypt and Algeria this time, before winning their final game, an ultimately meaningless one, over Sudan, again finishing 3rd of 4 and not advancing.
Yeah, I gotta say, a 1-0 win over Djibouti in the preliminary round is not that convincing either. Okay, on to World Cup 2022 then, and they received a bye in round 1 because they were not one of the 12 weakest teams in the region. So their competition really began in round 2.
Yeah, and it was a 5-team group that was reduced to 4 teams after North Korea withdrew. It actually helped Lebanon because they had lost to North Korea in their opening game. But Lebanon finished with a record of 3 wins, 1 draw, and 2 losses. They finished second of the group on 10 points, just a point ahead of Turkmenistan. But that was good enough to put them into the final round of qualifying.
All right, and in the final round of qualifying, they just got 1 win, and that was an away win in Syria, but Syria was playing its home games outside of the country, so more like neutral ground there. Actually did better on the road, tying UAE away and Iraq away. At home, the only result they earned was a 1-1 draw with Iraq. So it all added up to a last place finish in the group. They were tied on points with Syria, but finished behind them in 6th place. So a bit out of their league in the final round once again.
Yeah, they did well to reach it for the 2nd time in their history, but out of their league, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Anyway, the first 2 rounds of that did make up Asian 2023 qualifying. So how did they fare there?
Yeah, just to recap, because they finished 2nd in their group, they earned automatic passage to the Asian Cup. Didn't need the extra qualifying round, which they required the previous edition.
Yes, that's right. Okay, and then that brings us then to the end of Lebanon. Once again, we're going to skip our look at the players and perhaps catch up with that in a future media cast. And we'll move on to our last team here, Tajikistan, and begin with an overview of their participation and overall strength.
So Tajikistan first entered World Cup qualifying in 1998, and they've participated consistently ever since. Their first Asian Cup entry was 2 years earlier in 1996, and there too their participation has been consistent. Their local group is CAFA, or the Central Asian Football Association. That locale was slow in getting started, forming in 2015, but they only played their first cup in 2023.
Right, so we'll look at that in the recent section. In terms of Tajikistan's overall strength, they're an inconsistent third-tier team in Asia. They have never reached the final round of World Cup qualifying, nor have they reached an Asian Cup. In fact, they were relegated to the AFC Challenge Cup. Relegated is a strong word because the teams could choose it, but the tournament was designed for teams that were really not competitive in the Asian Cup. So in lieu of the Asian Cup, this competition was created for weaker teams. And they were initially one of the stronger teams at that level, but actually, unlike most teams, they grew weaker with time through that competition, although they since have come back to third-tier form in recent times. So let's begin with an overview of their World Cup history.
Tajikistan started strong in the competition, but actually grew weaker by degrees until a recent resurgence. In 1998, they finished second in the semi-final round, just 3 points behind China. In 2006, they finished third on a group of 4, and in 2010, didn't even reach the semi-final round. That did prove a low point, and they reached the semi-final round since, earning 1 point in 2014, 5 in 2018, and 13 in 2022. So we're able to track their improvement over the last couple editions.
Right, and we'll look at that improvement a bit more closely in the recent section, because the 2018 qualifying campaign will be covered in 2019 Asian Cup stuff. But speaking of the Asian Cup, let's do an overview of the regional cup before we do a deep dive. So that actual pattern that Connor mentioned, kind of growing weak and then a recent resurgence, is also evident in their Asian Cup play. They came close to reaching the cup in 1996 and in 2004, and that made them one of the strongest teams going into the AFC Challenge Cup. Once again, a tournament really designed for weaker teams in lieu of the Asian Cup. And they won the Challenge Cup in 2006 and then came second and third in subsequent editions. But in line with their World Cup form, they grew weaker, falling at the group stage in 2012 and not even qualifying for the Challenge Cup in 2014. In 2019, they and all other teams in the region returned to the newly formatted Asian Cup, which is now expanded to 24 teams. But a weak qualification campaign left them, well, why don't we save the drama for later when we look at that Asian Cup in detail. So let's move on, shall we, to the local cup. That is the CAFA Cup.
Yeah, in 2014, the Central Asian Football Association was created with Afghan and Iran leaving their regional federations and joining Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, who had no local body to that point. They were slow in setting up, but did hold their first tournament in 2023. Tajikistan is on the verge of being strong enough to pass the group stage of that tournament, but they were unfortunately grouped with invited nation Oman. They actually did well to tie them, but finished third in the group behind them and Uzbekistan.
Right, so knocked out in round 2, and actually that is also included in the recent section, which we'll get to after we take a look at their Asian Cup finals in detail. So we are just looking at the finals here. So their participation from 1996 up until, well, throughout the whole thing doesn't really matter because they've never reached the finals. But do you want to take us through that section? Because there is information in the Challenge Cup that we'll look at.
Yeah, so Tajikistan, as you said, had never reached an Asian Cup, so they have no history here. 2023 begins their history, and they are the only debutantes appearing in this tournament. So, yeah, good for them.
Yeah, good for them.
But like you said, we will talk about the AFC Challenge Cup, which they participated in when they were not participating in the Asian Cup for a period of time.
Yes, they have then a history in that Challenge Cup, and the tournament is often presented as an alternative for weaker teams. But technically, it was designed for, and I quote, teams in need of development. So this turned out to be an unfortunate principle because stronger teams like Palestine and North Korea eventually overpowered the tournament.
In the first edition in 2006, Tajikistan won their group stage despite a loss to Kyrgyzstan. They met them again in the semi-final, won, and moved on to the final where they beat Sri Lanka 4-0 actually to win the tournament's first title.
Yeah, pretty easy competition for them there, apart from Kyrgyzstan, and they did well to beat them in the semi-final. And we move on to 2008. Actually, there had been no qualifying in 2006, but there were qualification rounds from the 2008 edition onward, and they passed that and finished second in the group stage of the Cup itself after tying Turkmenistan and India. And that brought them to the semi-final, where they actually did well to beat North Korea, ostensibly the strongest team in the competition, and a team that reached the following World Cup, in fact. They met India again in the final, and they lost that game 4-1. So second place there.
They dropped one spot with a third place finish in 2010, despite losing to Bangladesh in the opener of the group stage. They won the group, but then lost to Turkmenistan in the semi-final. However, a win over Myanmar earned them third place.
Third place, so dropping one spot every time. And in 2012, they reached the finals after beating India in the first group stage game, and they lost to an improving Philippines and to North Korea also. In 2014, however, they failed to even qualify. And that's kind of evidence of the tournament's increasing competitiveness and also of their downfall into weakness.
In 2016, the Challenge Cup became the Solidarity Cup, a tournament now truly for the weaker teams, really those knocked out in the early rounds of Asian Cup qualifying. But Tajikistan's improvement, surviving those early rounds, meant they were now too strong for that competition.
Right. Okay, and so that is the end of the deep dive, and brings us to our recent history for Tajikistan. And I said that actually we do cover the 2018 World Cup because it is the first two rounds for the Asian 2019 Cup. So how did they do in those?
Yeah, so they were not one of the 12 lowest ranked teams required to play in the preliminary round. So they joined at the round 2 of 3 group stage. However, they only won one game, a large win actually over Bangladesh, who they finished ahead of, but they were behind Australia, Jordan, and Kyrgyzstan, collecting just 5 points. They actually met Bangladesh again in kind of a round 2B of qualification, beating them 6-0 in aggregate, and then proceeded to, the final round, which was a 4-team group stage.
Yeah, I'll explain that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
It's actually, you know, what we've talked about, Asia's good efforts to include weak teams. So the way it worked is those kind of knocked out in the second round get another crack at getting into the third round. So Tajikistan and Bangladesh, not because they were in the same group, they just happened to be paired for this playoff. So Tajikistan won and went to round 3. Bangladesh may have gotten actually one more chance to get to round 3, but ultimately, if they don't, then they drop to the Solidarity Cup.
Right. So, in that round 3, it was a round robin where each team played each other home and away. Tajikistan finished with 2 wins, both coming over Nepal, who they finished ahead of. But they collected just 1 point from games against Yemen and the Philippines. So they finished third and did not advance to the 2019 Asian Cup.
Yeah, that was probably their best chance, because I think their round 3 in 2022 is against tougher opposition. Hang on, we're talking about teams that did make it. So obviously they improved to get to this cup. But we'll come to that. But first, we'll look at World Cup 2022 qualification.
Yeah, so again, they entered in round 2 of 3, and it was an improved performance. They won 4 of their 8 games and finished second in the group behind Japan, albeit by 11 points, but they finished ahead of Kyrgyzstan, Mongolia, and Myanmar. Unfortunately for them, finishing second in the group with 13 points wasn't enough to move on to the final round of World Cup qualifying, but a pretty good showing against teams of similar strength.
Yeah, it really was. Among the eight second place finishers, 6 of them made it to the next round. 5 of them made it to the next round, and Tajikistan finished 6th, so very close to making it to the final round of World Cup qualification there, but just falling short.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're going to actually come back to that because it's also the first 2 rounds for the Asian Cup in 2023. But let's take a look at the first edition of the CAFA Cup in a bit more detail.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier. So Tajikistan started with draws against Turkmenistan and Oman, and then lost heavily 5-1 to Uzbekistan. So they finished 3rd out of 4 in the group, and that was not enough to advance to the next round.
Yeah, Oman an invited guest there, and probably taking their spot there. Okay, and yes, going back to the 2022 World Cup, then they finished second in the group, and where did they go from there?
From there, they went into round 3, which was a 4-team group stage, just like it was previously. This time it wasn't home and away, but just a single round robin. And Tajikistan carried their good form from the first round, or from the previous round into this one, beating Myanmar and Singapore before tying Kyrgyzstan. But they didn't concede a goal, and they finished top of the group to qualify for this tournament.
Yeah, that's a good campaign and a good sign of their improvement, because I think this group with Singapore especially is a bit tougher than the group they had in 2019, but they were certainly more competitive in this group, so good for them. Whether that will make them competitive in the Asian Cup, I guess we will talk about in our discussion, which is coming up soon. But we actually are at the end of part 2 here, and I'll just reiterate that we're gonna save our discussion of their players for future podcasts. So we move on to part 3, where we compare the teams to each other in various things, starting with the pots. What was the pot order like here?
Yeah, so the pot 1 team is Qatar. They're ranked 61st in the world, so they're given the kind of pot or spot 1A as host. They still would have been in pot 1 were they not host. It was just based on rankings, but they would have been the weakest team in that pot. So pot 1, but I guess compared to other pot 1 teams, the weakest according to the rankings at the time of the draw.
Right.
Next is China. They're the pot 2 team. They are kind of near the bottom of pot 2, second bottom out of the 6 teams. Next we have Lebanon, and they're the lowest ranked team in pot 3, so just squeaking in there. And then Tajikistan are the second team out of pot 4, second of 6. So I guess overall, Tajikistan, I guess the exception, but most of these teams come from near the bottom of their pots, which may point to a slightly weaker group overall.
Yeah, definitely. That's an interesting analysis, actually. It also kind of suggests that Tajikistan would be competitive with Lebanon, not being too far behind them there. Let's look at, in terms of FIFA rankings and also ELO rankings, where do they stand in relation there?
All right, so Qatar is currently 58th in the world, according to FIFA, and 77th according to ELO. Qatar peaked in 2019 after winning the Asian Cup at 55th, so they've fallen just a little bit since then. They actually rose as high as 28th in ELO at that same period, but then have dropped much further to 77th. Typically, we find ELO less reactive to recent events, but Not the case with Qatar. But yeah, higher.
Yeah, absolutely. They jumped from 75th to 28th by winning the Asian Cup, and now they're back down to 77th in 2023. So a pretty roller coaster ride there.
Yep.
Okay, how about China?
China are 79th in FIFA and 86th in ELO. And actually, that's kind of a rough average for them over the past, 5 or 7 years. They haven't really moved too far up or too far down. So, yeah, a little bit behind Qatar in both systems, 79th and 86th.
Yeah, actually, fully 21 points behind in the FIFA system, but only 9 points behind in ELO. So it'll be good to discuss which of those we think is more accurate.
Yeah. Lebanon, meanwhile, they're 102nd in FIFA and 135th in ELO. Lebanon actually got to 79th, so they broke the 80th mark in June 2018, but have kind of slipped a little bit since then. It's a similar story from ELO. They kind of peaked around that time and have since slid, though again more dramatically, falling from 91st to 135th, which is where they sit currently.
Yeah, so they broke the 100 barrier and then fell out of it again, but significantly behind China in both of the systems.
Yeah. And then finally for Tajikistan, we've talked about their recent improvement, and this tracks in both systems. They're 109th in FIFA and 126th in ELO, so actually ahead of Lebanon in the ELO system. And that's kind of shown steady improvement really since June 2016, when they were 164th and 155th. So they've kind of climbed slowly and steadily to close to 100th in FIFA, a little bit behind in ELO.
Yeah, as you say, ahead of Lebanon in the ELO system, so that'll also make for interesting discussion and not too far behind. But in addition to those numbers, it also feels like momentum may be a factor for Tajikistan also.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see if any of this plays out in the head-to-head, and we begin. Well, maybe if you announce them, and then I'll add a bit of detail if necessary.
Yeah, so starting with Qatar versus Lebanon, they've met 5 times, and Qatar has won each of those 5 matches.
Yeah, and 2 of them were in 1986. Actually, Qatar thrashed Lebanon in both of those games. 2014, closer, but Qatar won both. 1-0 in 2014 World Cup qualifying, and then most recently in the group stage in the 2019 Asian Cup, where Qatar steamrolled them on the way to win the tournament 2-0 in that game. Next
is Qatar and Tajikistan, and they actually have no competitive record, so nothing to speak of there.
Right.
So move on to Qatar versus China, and it's China with the winning record, though it's a competitive one. China with 7 wins, 4 draws, and Qatar with 5 victories there.
Yeah, I mean, again, Qatar probably with a bit of more recent momentum there. 2000 Asian Cup quarterfinal was their biggest meeting. China was a stronger team then and won 3-0. They met 4 times in the course of the 2018 World Cup qualifying, so in the semi-final and the final group. And China came out ahead there too, winning 2, tying 1 and losing 1. So they still seem to have the edge over Qatar, even in recent times.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Next is China versus Tajikistan. China has a record of 1 win and 1 draw.
Yeah, that was back in 1998, so probably not that relevant.
And then China versus Lebanon, they've met twice, and China won both.
Yeah, and that was in 2011, so not sure how much relevance that has either, but probably relatively the stronger team still.
And then finally, Tajikistan versus Lebanon. Well, they've never met. Perhaps not a huge surprise. So that history will be made at this tournament.
Yeah, so not a lot of insight in the head-to-heads. I'd say China and Qatar, the more interesting one, and China, seem to consistently have the edge on Qatar. We'll see if that plays out. We'll see if that plays out in the tournament. But actually, because we don't have odds on the group to see how the professional odds makers are thinking about things, we just move on to the final discussion here. So maybe let us go back to the FIFA rankings, because I don't feel the head-to-heads really show much. And I'll ask you if you feel that Qatar is basically 21 points ahead of China, or just 9 points ahead of China.
I probably think it's 21. I know they had a disappointing World Cup, but they are the defending Asian Cup champions. And they've had probably some inconsistent results ever since that triumph, but some good results in there too. Whereas China, I think, are firmly a second-tier team. So no, I do think Qatar, especially playing at home, kind of deserves the gap that the FIFA rankings represent.
Yeah, that home advantage, of course, is important, I think, and I don't really put the World Cup down too much. I mean, they were kind of always a bit out of their league there, and maybe the 2019 Asian Cup was an early peak, or maybe they were just out of their depth at that level. I'm more concerned about how they've been since then, and for me, the biggest change is the change of manager from Felix Sanchez, who I viewed as a very positive character, to Carlos Queiroz, who's quite negative. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think they built well under Felix Sanchez. I think he might be in Ecuador now. He's kind of gone on, actually one of Qatar's rivals from the World Cup. I do think Queiroz is a bit more of a negative manager in terms of style of play and even in terms of discipline and things like that. So I don't think it's a necessarily a positive step forward for Qatar.
Yeah, I think we're both thinking of the recent Gold Cup, which we didn't cover here, but 13 yellow cards and 1 red card. They were lucky to get past the group stage, whereas in 2021 they quite convincingly got past the group stage. In the quarterfinal game there, they had 6 or 7 players under suspension. It was just a big mess, and that's what we mean by Carlos Queiroz being a kind of a negative influence on the team. And the other thing is there were some players like Akram Afif who they didn't bring to that cup. Almoez was, I think, kind of came in injured or sick or something, but ineffective. So all of the players of the 2019 Asian Cup, most of them were gone. Some of them too old, but some of them just left off the team. So there are signs of them coming back in. Do you think they can get back to what they were in 2019?
Probably not that that strong, but I think when they were obviously building for years towards the World Cup, but the goal wasn't to do well in the World Cup and then fall back off. The goal is to maintain it, to be a team that probably in their minds can be competing with the elite teams, Japan and Korea and Saudi Arabia. So I think that's the level they want to get to. I think they showed it that they could get there at the last World Cup, at the last Asian Cup. Form has fallen off a little bit, and I think this Asian Cup could be a bit of a turning point to see whether it was kind of a flash in the pan or whether they can actually build towards being a sustainable top team in the region.
Yeah, we always wondered how they would be going forward, but I think a lot of people thought, they put a lot of money into their World Cup team and they kind of came out from nowhere. That's not true. They've been a second-tier team in the region for a long time, and sure, putting the money in and preparing for the World Cup was a bit to make them a top-tier team, which probably didn't work. But I still think a solid second-tier team, and as you said, with home advantage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my question is not so much if they weaken, but are any of the teams below strong enough to overcome them, especially at home? And you've talked a little bit about China, but any more to say on that?
No, I mean, I think with China, they're just the sleeping giant that you're waiting to wake up. I guess like India, though China are at a higher level. I see China as getting out of this group. They should be beating kind of the pot 3 and 4 teams. I don't not sure they have quite enough to challenge Qatar, but I don't really see them being entirely susceptible to a threat from below. But what do you think? Do you think Lebanon and Tajikistan have a shot at finishing second?
I'm kind of with you. I mean, it's not really a comment on China's strength, but more of a comment on the level of competition here. China have always been consistent over third and fourth tier teams. We saw in the quarterfinals of the last cup that they didn't have much problem with Thailand, so I don't think they'll have much problem against the teams here. But I think kind of going forward into the competition, they really are a second tier team. And of course, they should be a first tier team. I've actually, I taught at the university there a lot of Chinese students in the class, so the ones knowledgeable about soccer. And they basically seem to think the same that I do, that they should be better. But they kind of saw the problem as, you know, bureaucracy and kind of old style old, you know, in 2002 when Goose Heating came in and kind of broke up some practices of older players and younger players and showing too much respect to older players and stuff like that. So the students kind of seem to be saying things like that, like they're just not very progressive. In the player section that we planned, I was going to talk about the teams. China used to make it to the Asian region has its own kind of Champions League, and the Chinese teams were developing there for a while, as you probably know. But they were getting a couple of teams into, say, the final rounds of those championship club competitions, and over the last few years they really haven't, so their club form has fallen off quite a bit too, and you know that produces the players that would be in this tournament.
Yeah, even looking at rankings, we talked about China's just long-term stability, not really moving up, not really sliding down, and I kind of see them as that in this tournament, you know, probably where it deserved to be, where they are ahead of a lot of third tier teams, but not competing with the first tier ones. And we saw that too in World Cup qualifying, where they only picked up 1 win over Vietnam in the 10 games they played in that round.
Yeah, you know, the sleeping giant argument has been around for hundreds of years, in fact, but it's never really come to fruition in the soccer. They seem to be getting weaker, in fact. So I agree with you that they'll probably finish second in this group, but they don't seem any kind of a match for top tier teams. So I don't think they'll get far beyond this round.
Yeah. The bottom two are interesting in that Lebanon is ranked 7 places ahead of Tajikistan in FIFA, but actually 9 spots behind them in ELO. So perhaps there's a bit of confusion over who is the pot 3 and pot 4 team. And we mentioned that although Lebanon is a pot 3 team, they're only just into pot 3, whereas Tajikistan at the top of pot 4. So do you think those teams are virtually equal, or do you give the edge to one or the other?
It's kind of tough to say because they both have arguments in their favor. I mean, Lebanon has reached the final round of World Cup qualifying. They have reached the Asian Cup before. Tajikistan have not done either of those things. We did see actually they were a lot closer than most people think in 2022 to the final round of World Cup qualifying. But in terms of momentum, that definitely seems to be in Tajikistan's favor, where they looked a lot stronger in 2023 Asian Cup qualifying, which includes the World Cup qualifying in the first 2 rounds. So I'm almost tempted to say that Tajikistan it is looking slightly better going into this tournament, but definitely Lebanon has history on their side. What do you think?
I do agree that that the form favors Tajikistan. I think Lebanon, even though they didn't do particularly well in the final round of World Cup qualifying, they probably will have gained some good experience playing a higher, against higher level teams, whereas Tajikistan don't really have that, even competing in the Challenge Cup for all those years. So, so I think it'll be close. I think these teams, their best chance of points is obviously against each other. A tie would kind of eliminate the chance of either one of them getting through as one of the 4 best third place teams. But I think they will be competitive. It's a tough one to call.
It is, and it'll probably, the game between them, of course, will be the biggest factor, but it'll come down, especially if we're talking about a third place team advancing, to whether they can take any points off the teams above them. So returning to that, even though we've kind of called China as a second place finisher here, do you think it's possible for these teams to take any points off of the top 2?
I think it's possible, even if I wouldn't necessarily predict it. China, can drop points. Qatar too, their form really since the World Cup has been quite erratic. Even before that, losing to some teams they really shouldn't be. So it's possible, but like I said, I wouldn't predict it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like one of the things when you start looking at weaker teams is, they do have their successes, especially at the game level. But then you start falling into thinking that, they can take on the teams of a higher tier. And in fact, that's a very hard bridge to gap. So, Tajikistan is kind of a third tier team here. It would really be an event for them to take points off of teams and especially to be successful at the campaign level by doing so. So as much as I kind of admire Tajiki's momentum coming in, it's very hard for teams to bring it to the cup and to actually make it happen at the campaign level.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're kind of both leaning towards pot order here, but I'm going to nail you down here because you've been so evasive. And I'm going to say, how do you think this is going to end?
I'm going to say mostly pot order, Qatar and China, but maybe I'll give the edge to Tajikistan based on momentum. I know I spoke about Lebanon's history, but in a one-off game, I see Tajikistan perhaps more likely to win it. So I'm going to go Tajikistan 3rd and Lebanon 4th.
Yeah, honestly, despite what I just said about moving up a tier, I kind of feel that coming. I don't think Lebanon is so far above Tajikistan that they can't be taken. And actually, Lebanon has kind of always underperformed a little. They should have been in more cups than they have been. And so I think if I'm pinned down to it, I'm going to say Qatar, China, Tajikistan, and Lebanon.
All right.
You too?
Yeah, we are in agreement.
Okay. All right. Well, that is brings us to the end of our Group A examination. So we will see you again for Group B.
All right. See you next time.
We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the media cast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We'd like to thank Naver Avichan and Pixabay for the wonderful music you hear in this media cast. The title is called Arabic Trap.